Hello again, all. Dr. JC here. One more time in week 4 or lecture 4. This is part 3. We're going to build off the previous two parts. The previous two parts were in part 1, the French and Indian War, part 2, the American Revolution, and then part 3, this part right here, we're going to talk about the French Revolution. Just as part 1 caused part 2, the American Revolution, is going to cause part 3, which is this French Revolution and the rise of this guy named Napoleon or Napoleonic Europe. So let's jump right into this French Revolution. As I mentioned at the end of the previous part, the American Revolution really does cause a financial problem for the French. King Louis needs to find ways to refill the nation's coffers, and as a result of that, they fall back on the age-old way governments raise revenue: taxes. While one would be hard-pressed to find any living soul that enjoys paying taxes, whether in the age of the French Revolution or our own, there is one thing that we need to consider here as it relates to French society in the age of the French Revolution. Not all Frenchmen paid taxes. French society was broken into what were called 3 estates, 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 a first, second, and third estate. The first and second estates, for all intents and purposes, were nobility and church leaders. So you have these sort of those that pray and those that fight. And then the third estate was everybody else. And it's only the third estate, the everybody else, meaning those individuals that didn't really have a lot to begin with. They're the ones being asked to pay taxes. You can see where this is going to be a problem for King Louis, right? At some point, that third estate, which greatly outnumbers the other two estates, is going to call BS on the king and say, look, why don't you go tax your buddies, all right? Because we're done paying them. While I'm not going to get granular as it relates to the French Revolution, because we could spend 16 weeks here and still not scratch the surface. It's that detailed, there's so much going on, that convoluted, just too many moving parts. I do want to focus on this idea of estates and what brought about the revolution, though. Realizing he has a problem, he being the king, he authorizes the calling of an estates general. Now, as the prose on this slide shows here, this is the first time the estates general has been called in like 170 some odd years. So it gives us some idea of the true pressure the king is under here. He recognizes he's sitting on a powder keg. The French people are ready to blow. So when this call goes out for the Estates General, the French people are like crazy happy. Wow, finally we get a chance to go and have a voice, have a say, get involved in the discussions about the direction of the country, so on and so forth. And thus individuals, French individuals, part of this third estate, they will elect individuals to go represent the third estate at the Estates General. Things look good. Yet when the 3 estates do meet, the air is going to completely go out of the third estate. And in some ways, maybe it was better to just leave the third estate upset than to provide them with a degree of hope only to entirely disappoint them, because that's going to lead to further frustration, anger, and outburst. So you say, well, what in the blue blazes happened? How did the third estate get let down? Well, the king decided that once the estates came together, any votes that were taken, any decisions that would be made by vote, would not be done by individuals, but by estates. So you can see where this is going to be a problem for folks in the third estate. We like way outnumber you other 2 estates, but because you other 2 estates are in bed with the king more or less, we're always going to lose on a 2-to-1 vote. This is nonsense. No, this is lunacy. And members of the Third Estate, imbued with the ideas of the American independence movement, the idea that people can govern themselves without freaking kings, members of the Third Estate say, you know what? Screw you, pal. Screw you First Estate, screw you Second Estate, screw you King. We're going to go down the street here, which they do, to an indoor tennis court, and they swear an oath inside this tennis court, called the tennis court oath, that they will not stop meeting. Doesn't matter what the king has to say. We will not stop meeting until we have a constitution here in France, just like the Americans have some degree of self-represented government. We will not stop until we have that here in France. Naturally, as you may well imagine, the king is not going to like this. He looks to rein in the French citizens, and many of you guys know the story. The king and his wife eventually are going to lose their heads over this. They will. The French Revolution is going to turn a lot bloodier, a lot nastier than the American Revolution ever did, save perhaps along the American frontier, where it was really pretty Hatfields versus McCoys. It was. But the French Revolution will turn out differently than the American Revolution. The Americans figuratively killed George III, their king. The French will literally kill their king. For those interested in the various components of the French Revolution, this National Assembly turned Legislative Assembly turned National Convention turned Directory before some guy named Napoleon does this coup d'etat, as the French call it, quick seizure of power. If you're interested in those components, I'd ask that you go ahead and research those on your own. Rather, I'm going to skip to the point at the end when some guy named Napoleon institutes a coup and takes over the French government and comes to power. Just like the French Revolution, we could easily spend 16 weeks alone on Napoleon Bonaparte. We just don't have the time for that. Therefore, what I'm going to do, as I've done in previous parts and previous lectures, I'm going to go ahead and cherry pick a couple salient features or aspects as it relates to Napoleon or this age of Napoleon and highlight them here, especially because of their relation to future topics. Most specifically, I'm going to focus on the information on the right-hand side of this slide here, which I'll zoom in on. The impact of the Enlightenment on Napoleon and how Napoleon's army, as he moves across Europe, is actually going to spread liberal reforms and ideas across Europe. Therefore, in a strange sort of way, just as France and Napoleon's going to look to take over the entire continent of Europe, they're going to help also spread liberal reforms and ideas among the peoples that eventually is going to lead to these social uprisings in 1830 and 1848, which we'll talk about in the future, that's going to bring an end to monarchical systems across Europe. So a strange sort of dichotomy that we see take place here in enlightened Emperor Napoleon. How much Napoleon's upbringing and formative years impacted his ability to embrace and apply these enlightened ideals remains subject to some discussion and debate. We do know he was born on the island of Corsica, therefore he's Corsican as much as he is French. And therefore in some ways, especially in high French society, he's an other. When he studied at the École Militaire, the French Military Academy, the famed sort of West Point of France as it were, when he studied there he was picked on. Not just because he was a short dude. Excuse me, for those politically correct, he was vertically challenged. No, he's freaking short. Not only because he was a short dude, but because he was an other. Now, how much this impacted him as he got older and came to power, again, is subject to some debate. What we do know is that he embraced enlightened ideals, and he truly looked to win the hearts and minds of the French people, if less so, the French upper class. Important distinction there. He quickly came to recognize and understand he who controls the third estate controls the entire state of France. Win the people and you have the country. In order to win the hearts and minds of people, Napoleon goes right to work. Calls for a huge expansion of public works. We're going to build roads, canals, bridges, schools, hospitals, you name it. We're not only going to improve the life of the average French citizen, we're going to help the average French businessman expand his businesses, expedite trade. And at the same time, we're going to begin to hire unemployed people to put them to work in these public works programs. We're also going to help this unemployment problem by expanding the military. It's an important note to make here as it relates to the French military that its officer corps for the longest period of time was based on aristocratic hereditary rank rather than one's own ability or merit. Thus, under the old system, when Louis was king, the long-standing, long-held rules and rights of primogeniture and entail were in place. What that means is that the firstborn son was going to get everything daddy had. And the second-born son, well, you had two choices. You could kill your older brother, or you could go ahead, because you have a famous family name, you're part of the king's inner circle, you can go ahead and accept a position in the church or a high officer grade position in the military, whether it be in the army or the navy. So it was really based on one's name and hereditary rank rather than their ability to lead. Under Napoleon, he blows that up. Says, nah, that ain't happening. I want the best and most capable to lead. And we're going to look to the third estate to go ahead and create this junior and then eventually senior officer corps. I want the best to rise because the best will help me beat the ever-living piss out of the rest of the folks that exist in Europe. Because me, Napoleon, being the megalomaniac that I am, I want the entire damn continent. And I certainly would love to make the damn British pay too. Thus, Napoleon's reforms are really bent towards helping develop a vibrant middle class. People that didn't necessarily have the ability to do what they wanted to do, to rise. He puts that in place for them. He sets up a new structure and system, a new set of social standards and norms that says it's okay for individuals to try. It's okay for individuals to succeed and rise. And in some ways, is not this just the sort of spirit of the Renaissance as much as the Enlightenment? If your people are great, your state will be great. Now think about the impact of that as Napoleon's armies begin to march across Europe over the next decade, and they will. When they get into new countries that still have kings, like Austria, and they take over these lands after winning great victories like at Austerlitz, the garrisons that are left behind, what's the officer corps in those garrisons going to do? They're going to go have a beer at a local bar or pub. And they're going to sit at the bar in the pub and have a discussion with folks around them saying, why do you guys still have a king? We don't have a king. We have schools and hospitals, and yeah, we may be seen here in some sense as conquerors, but maybe perhaps you ought to think about us as being liberators. And maybe you ought to call your own king into question if there's some misery that you're living right now. Maybe you guys need to go ahead and pull your king down and change your society. So the French example, the Enlightenment and Renaissance that's embedded in many ways in Napoleon and Napoleonic reform will be spread across Europe, and it will help establish and plant seeds that are going to germinate in 1830 and again in 1848. These two great eras of revolutions, which we'll talk about in a future week of the class. Thus, while historians and others are correct to focus on Napoleon's warmongering, his battlefield victories, and defeats, such as the one depicted here, the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, we do have to give him some props and remember the reforms that he put into place. Remember that he enabled the French people to have a go at life, something that wasn't available to the vast majority of them under the ancient regime, that ancien regime of King Louis and his forebears. Prior to concluding this part and lecture 4 in its entirety, I wanted you to focus for a minute on this slide, point number 1, where it states that over 600,000 soldiers would be engaged here at this Battle of Leipzig. Now, this won't be the battle that ends Napoleon's reign. Most of you guys know that's Waterloo. We'll talk about that in a couple weeks' time, all right? But the 600,000 number, I do want you to think about once we get to World War I and the lectures on World War I. 600,000 here was the number engaged, the largest battle in Europe at the time. Once we get to World War I want you to recall that 600,000 in relation to battlefield deaths in individual European battles in World War I. We'll get to that in weeks ahead. But for now, we'll pivot next to Lecture 5. And in Lecture 5, we're going to stay in the first part in North and South America, talk about the development of the Americas further. And then we're going to jump back to Europe and talk about various isms that start to emerge, nationalism and others. And we'll also pick back up here with Napoleon and talk about how his demise led to this sort of reshaping of Europe and how that may have played into these revolutions in 1830 and 1848, which we talked about briefly in this part. Dr. JC out, part 3, lecture 4. We'll head to lecture 5 next.